also like to thank all of you for keeping to time, because we do have a large number of speakers, and it's been marvellous. Thank you all. I'm hoping there are some people in the audience who will want to ask questions of our candidates. What I've asked you to do is to line up over here next to Darren. We've got a microphone over there. So Darren, if you put your hand up. Thank you. So I'd also ask that you keep your questions brief, and that they are questions, that they're not comments. You can direct your questions to any one of the candidates, so we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Alberto. I live at the Royal towards Redford. Question to Tanya. I've been waiting for many years, for a decade, to have the option to marry my partner of 30 years, my loving partner. And I've been told that I've got to wait for a plebiscite, and I'm not sure what will happen after that. What's your view? Do we really need such a move from our Parliament?
No, plebiscite is divisive and wasteful. It will cost about $160 million according to the Australian Electoral Commission. We know that the Federal Parliament has the responsibility to legislate in this area. There's been a High Court decision to that effect. So if we're elected, we would introduce marriage equality legislation within the first 100 days of the new government. I have twice introduced a private member's bill on marriage equality. The Liberals could have voted for it at any time. In fact, I wrote to every Liberal and National MP in March 2014 asking them if they would co-sponsor a bill. None of them would. Then the next stage was Bill Shorten moved a bill. Malcolm Turnbull said he couldn't allow his MPs... it was Tony Abbott still. Tony Abbott said he couldn't allow his MPs to vote for something that was so party political and that leaders shouldn't be involved. So we handed the responsibility to two backbenchers, to Terry Butler in Queensland and Warren Inch from Queensland, and then Tony Abbott ambushed his party room and pushed through in a joint meeting of the Liberals and Nationals commitment not to allow a free vote in the Parliament on marriage equality, but instead to go with this dodgy plebiscite. And the cost of Malcolm Turnbull becoming leader was a commitment to the Nationals to stick with Tony Abbott's policy. The cost was climate change, the cost was the plebiscite on marriage equality, and he made a whole lot of other side deals at the same time. We absolutely don't believe that there should be a plebiscite. We think that the sort of divisive speech you've already heard from people like Cory Bernardi, who's at it again today, would become commonplace for the year or however long it takes. I'm very worried about what would happen to young people hearing messages about the fact that there's something wrong with their sexuality, or kids growing up in families with same-sex parents being told that there's something wrong with their family. I do have to just add one final thing, and that is that if Labor's elected and we proceed with this legislation, there is an exemption for churches. We don't believe that any church should be forced to marry any couple against the religious convictions of the church. So that would mean that if your church didn't agree to marry, you could get married with a celebrant or in a registry office, but we're not going to make the Catholic Church marry people.
Thank you, Jane. I'd ask if it's okay that the candidates also keep their answers quite short, because otherwise we'll be here for quite a while. So, hand over to the next questioner. Thank you.
Yes, Minnie Ingram. For Tanya. Tanya, I was really pleased to hear Bill Shorten say that he would have a conversation with the Aboriginal people, or with the Australian people, but particularly with the Aboriginal people, about a treaty, and then Turnbull went ballistic. And I hope the conversation doesn't stop. I was just so happy about that, and I hope that whichever way this election goes, that you will keep pushing for that conversation. I'd like to assure all the good people here that a treaty will not affect you. It will just make things better for Aboriginal people. Just the same as the New South Wales land rights legislation. It didn't affect anybody's backyard or their farm, and neither did native title. And they're more reluctant to give native title to Aboriginal people are than that they sell off the whole of Australia to China. So the conversation should still go ahead about a treaty, irrespective of how the constitutional recognition goes, whether it goes in, but it's just so costly again, and it's unnecessary as far as I'm concerned. But I just want you to give us assurance, and I would also like this from all the minority parties and all the independents, that to keep the conversation, he didn't commit to any treaty, he just said he would have a conversation. I thought that was great, because that's what we, the Aboriginal people, want, is a conversation on a treaty. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Of course, we agree that the first step. I feel a little bit differently to you about the constitutional recognition, because I know that you're very sceptical about the importance of constitutional recognition. I feel like it would be a real tragedy if we have a vote next year and people vote no to constitutional recognition. I think that would be a very bad message to send about Australia. So I'd like a yes vote in the constitutional referendum, and then to continue to have the discussion about maybe not just one treaty, maybe many, because we're talking about many different nations.
Do other candidates want to support or add a comment to Tanya? Okay, thank you. Otherwise we'll run over. Thank you, Millie, because that's such an important question. I think what we should be demanding, and the Greens policy is that there should be treaties now. We talk about, and working in native title, I think one of the most important things is that people may not be aware that the two major parties had to switch off the Racial Discrimination Act to bring in the Native Title Act and those changes. We currently have a system where even when people work so many years, and you of course would be aware of this, through land rights and through native title and through the courts to win small real gains that relate to real economic development, the Parliament then turns around and says we're going to minimise that and stop that. And the only way to protect, to make sure those protections are entrenched, are beyond the Constitution to genuine treaties, and it's obscene that Australia is one of the only countries that has a similar Indigenous population that hasn't done that. So it needs to be about more than a conversation, because to be honest, Bob Hawke promised a treaty in 1988.
Socialist Alliance is very, very unhappy with the whole recognition thing. We see it as, on one hand, being a massive, expensive act of tokenism, but even worse than that, it might actually serve, according to some opinions, to actually erode further sovereignty claims by Indigenous communities. Now, we support the idea of treaties being negotiated, but we are more focused on getting something real happening down to close the gap. Because we feel almost any piece of paper that can be signed without addressing the real gap is not really closing. You know, it's going to take 495 years before the life expectancy gap closes at the current rate. I mean, that is just not acceptable. 495 years, more than twice as long as the length of the colonisation of this continent. So we would prefer some real action, some real action to close the gap, and on that basis, there will be some substance to any piece of paper, call it a treaty or treaties, whatever, and that will mean something to Indigenous communities.
Thank you,
My question is also to Tanya. I'm prepared to actually surrender my spot so that one of the other questioners can address a question to one of the other candidates.
Just jump in, please. You stand in line. No, jump in.
Okay.
Sir.
Tanya, actually, I have three very simple questions. So I think
Hang on, you get one.
they're capable of three simple answers.
Okay.
First, on WestConnex. If Labor's opposed to WestConnex, how does Labor propose to deal with the growing problem of getting freight into and out of Botany and the airport? On climate change, how is the Labor Party policy on emissions trading and increased renewables consistent with exporting coal? And on budget repair, we've heard scant detail about Labor's policy on spending and tax. Last weekend, there was a an attempt to release more detail about its policy on a cut to tax to small business. How is Labor's policy on tax cuts to small business consistent with budget repair?
Okay, that is 3 separate questions, but I think we're up for it. But I would ask Tanya if you could keep your answers brief as possible. Thank you.
I'm sorry, and they are actually not yes/no answers. The first one on freight is actually really important. We've got a freight rail link that comes out of Port Botany that lies idle for about 60% of every day. So we have announced that we would fund the doubling of the freight rail link out of Port Botany. We would very much like to see an increase of traffic of containers by rail rather than taking trucks off the road. We've made 2 big infrastructure announcements in this campaign. One is the freight rail extension and one is the north-west to south-west rail link in the western suburbs. The second question was about the emissions trading and exporting coal. Well, I think we are doing our best to reduce reliance on coal in Australia. We have an electricity transformation plan. We've got several very old coal-fired power stations that should be phased out over the next few years, and we can do that. But there is still a significant demand for coal around the world, and I think that there will be coal exports in the foreseeable future. The third thing that you asked about was budget repair. So we've announced well over $100 billion of improvements to the budget bottom line. The first thing is we're not going to spend $50 billion on a tax cut to big business. $30 billion of that goes straight to overseas shareholders. $7.4 billion of that goes to the 4 big banks. The idea that they are going to go and reopen branches because they've got a tax cut is laughable. This is trickle-down economics at its worst. There's also a $16 billion tax cut for people earning $180,000 a year or more that we also wouldn't proceed with. Our negative gearing changes are worth about $33 billion. We've got multinational tax changes and high-end superannuation tax changes. We've announced that we wouldn't proceed with direct action. That's an $800 million saving. We wouldn't proceed with the new baby bonus, which is $1.2 billion saving. And we wouldn't proceed with the expensive and divisive plebiscite, $160 million saving. That's just a handful of the announcements we've made on the positive side of the ledger. And we will release all of our costings well out from the election, not the Thursday before the election, as the Liberals did in the last campaign.
Thanks to all the candidates for turning up tonight. It's great to see such diverse views. I'm also a candidate, William Burke, lead Senate candidate for Sustainable Australia, so I'm a little bit biased about this panel, but I have a quick question around transport, and recently the progressive think tank, the Australia Institute, put out a report around the time of the Victorian election around the transport situation there, and it found that the Liberal, Labor and Greens plans for transport would, and indeed the Liberal Party promised to buy a new train every month for 10 years that would not even come close to meeting demand for Victoria's soaring population, and that Melbourne is on a long-term course towards quote-unquote overwhelming congestion on its roads and rail lines. Given that the debilitating impacts of congestion are impacting on our quality of life negatively around Sydney, can I ask the member for Sydney, Tanya Plibersek, why do the major parties push rapid population growth at such elevated levels on the people of Australia? And given the recent SBS poll showing that 60% of Australians would prefer lower immigration, why won't you give democratic opportunity for people to discuss this issue?
Well, I think there is democratic opportunity to discuss it. You're here tonight, your colleague is here tonight, and I think it's wonderful that we have these discussions. I'm a supporter of immigration to Australia. I think it's one of the things that's made Australia great, and I think that in particular our migrant story, being one of the most successful multicultural communities on earth, is part of the thing that has made Australia great as well. I do accept that when we're talking about the numbers of people who are migrating to Australia, we do need to think about a variety of elements. We need to think about economic growth. You see countries with stagnant population growth, and they very often have struggling economies as well. That's true. I'm not making this shit up. And of course, you know, there will be different times when we have different requirements for different types of migration as well. We need to be sensitive to that. One of the concerns that we have in some of the free trade agreements, in particular the free trade agreement with China, was that there was there was the potential for large and unrestricted migration within Chinese enterprises to come and work in low-skilled work in Australia. That to my mind, is not appropriate migration when we've got people here who can do the work. On the other hand, there are plenty of times when we have shortages of particular professions, when actually our economy and our society would be badly affected if we restricted that type of migration. I also think we've got a policy to double the humanitarian intake, to double the number of refugees coming to Australia. When we were in government, we had 20,000 a year come in. The Liberals dropped that down to 13,750. We would take it back up to 27,000, so beyond where we were. And I think with 65 million displaced people in the world, with 1 in every 113 people now displaced or refugee, internally displaced, fleeing, that we have a responsibility as a good global citizen as well. So it is in our interest, it's always been in our interest to have a strong migration program, but I think it's also part of our responsibility as a good global citizen.
I wanted to ask a question for Sustainable Australia. How do you propose to pay for the baby boomers' pensions and healthcare with lower immigration? Is it going to be a higher tax on young people, or do we have less people?
Questions for the people doing you.
Just before I answer that question, I'd like to correct Tanya on that idea that low population growth is bad for your economy. The World Bank has actually found that 7 out of the top 10 countries in the world for GDP per capita have populations under 10 million that are barely growing at all. So I think the World Bank knows what they're talking about. As for the whole concept of governments running their budgets, population growth actually takes money away from the budget. There have been studies that have shown that every new person coming into Australia requires $200,000 worth of spending on infrastructure. Now, you do get money back in terms of that person working and paying tax, but often it may be 20 years before they've actually paid off the $200,000 that has been spent to provide the infrastructure in terms of schools, hospitals, and transport for that new person.